The transport ship descended through the violet haze of Thoraxis 9, its thrusters scattering dust spirals across the cracked plain below. The planet looked dead. Flat stretches of ochre sand, scattered black ridges that glimmered faintly under the filtered sun, and a horizon that shimmered with restless movement. Inside the drop bay, 12 cadets from different species checked their gear one final time. Each wore a survival harness coded to their biology, humming softly with built-in energy regulators and atmospheric sensors. Among them stood a human, Lieutenant Aaron Cole, tall, lean, his uniform stripped of unnecessary attachments. His harness was the only one that didn't glow. He had disabled its atmospheric shielding, earning a few raised eyebrows and quiet laughter from the other cadets. Aaron watched the storm patterns through the bay window, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tracked the spiraling columns of dust on the horizon. The data feed above the hatch blinked warnings about fluctuating magnetic activity, high particulate density, and rapid temperature shifts. He didn't need a readout to understand what that meant. The planet was alive with storms, fast, sharp, and unpredictable. His instructors had told him that Thoraxis 9 had no steady weather cycle, only chaos born of two colliding jet streams. The sand here wasn't ordinary either. It was infused with metallic fragments that made it conduct electricity and slice through synthetic fibers like knives. That fact had already claimed a few arrogant cadets in the previous trials. When the drop order came, the bay doors opened with a hiss of pressurized air and a roar of wind filled the chamber. One by one, the cadets leapt into the dust sea below. The air shimmered around them as their personal shields activated, forming bubbles of translucent energy that cut through the grit. Aaron dropped last, letting the others scatter in the direction of the signal beacon that marked the trial's starting zone. His descent was less elegant. No glowing shield, just a fabric glider catching the turbulent wind. When his boots hit the ground, the shock ran through his legs, but he steadied himself quickly and knelt to touch the sand. It was coarse and hot, but beneath the surface lay cooler layers, fine and compact. He let a handful run through his fingers, watching how it settled in the low depressions of the terrain. He had already begun mapping the landscape in his mind. The others had landed in a loose cluster. Their command units flickered to life, and glowing shelters began assembling automatically from compressed polymer pods. The structures unfolded like metallic flowers, petals snapping together to form domes. Alien cadets laughed through the comm channel, their voices layered in multiple tongues. A crystalline being from the Calith species activated a levitating scanner that projected a map of the surroundings. "The plain extends 6 kilometers to the east," she said proudly. "Flat terrain, minimal elevation, perfect for the test." Another, a scaled male from the Drath, stomped a clawed foot into the dust and grinned. "Easy ground for our kind. Let the storm come. We have force domes." Aaron didn't answer. He moved slowly, deliberately, scanning the horizon with his visor. The sunlight reflected off the faint haze that rolled across the land in waves. He noticed the slight tilt of the ridges, all facing one direction, carved by centuries of relentless wind. The formation reminded him of dunes back on Earth, sculpted by the steady breath of time. He crouched and pressed his palm flat on the ground, feeling the vibration of the wind through the sand. It was rising faster than expected. The storm wasn't due until nightfall, but nature didn't care about the instructor's schedule. He began to walk away from the group, dragging a broken piece of alloy panel behind him. The others watched in silence, their laughter subsiding when they realized he wasn't joking. The Drath cadet tilted his head, his crest flaring slightly. "Human, your shelter pod. Where is it?" Aaron didn't stop walking. "Didn't take one," he said simply. "It'll get shredded anyway." The reptilian male scoffed. "You plan to sleep under the open sky? You'll be peeled alive when the storm hits." Aaron didn't look back. "No," he said. "I plan to sleep under the ground." He reached a low depression about 200 meters away from the others. The basin was rimmed by jagged rocks that would act as partial windbreaks. The sand there was heavier, less likely to scatter. He dropped to one knee and began scraping at the surface with the alloy sheet, dragging furrows in long, parallel lines. The metal screeched against hidden pebbles. Sweat formed under his collar within minutes, but his movements were steady and rhythmic. The trench deepened slowly, just enough for him to crouch inside. The work was brutal under the burning light, but he had done worse in deserts back home. His hands remembered the motion, the measured strokes, the instinctive understanding of how to move sand so it didn't collapse back in. Behind him, the other cadets continued building their domes. Energy hums filled the air, and pale force fields shimmered like bubbles in the distance. The contrast between their precision and his primitive effort was almost comic. A crystalline cadet approached, her transparent body refracting the sunlight into a rainbow haze. "Human," she said in a tone that balanced curiosity and amusement. "You really think that pit will protect you from a Thoraxis storm?" He looked up briefly, shielding his eyes. "Not protect," he said. "Deflect. The wind wants to move sideways, not down. Trenches redirect it. If I stay below the flow, I stay dry." She tilted her head. "Primitive. Inefficient." He smiled faintly. "Effective." By late afternoon, he had dug 2 connected trenches forming an L shape, with one side facing away from the dominant wind. He reinforced the inner walls with hardened slabs of sand mixed with fragments of metallic debris that he pounded into a tight surface. The deeper he went, the cooler it became. His shoulders ached, but he didn't stop. When the first low rumble rolled across the sky, he knew he had only a couple of hours left before the full storm front reached them. The horizon darkened as a dense curtain of dust began to rise, swallowing the sun in slow motion. The other cadets activated their shelter's shields, which glowed in hues of blue, gold, and violet. Energy fields hummed, sealing each dome in a tight, shimmering layer. Some aliens cheered through the comms, confident in their technology. Aaron watched quietly as he sat at the bottom of his trench, holding a small piece of metal he had shaped into a crude scoop. He packed the upper rim of the trench with sand, leaving only a narrow gap for ventilation. The world around him was turning gray. The wind carried the sharp scent of ozone and iron. He thought briefly about Earth, about deserts where storms could bury entire vehicles, about survival instructors who had said that nature rewarded those who respected its rhythm instead of fighting it. He had learned to read the signs long before joining the academy. The way the wind changed tone just before it gained speed, the sudden stillness that meant the air pressure had shifted, the fine dust that clung to skin moments before a downpour. On Thoraxis 9, all of those instincts returned at once. When the first gusts hit, he crouched deeper and covered his head with his pack. The wind roared like a beast unleashed, tearing through the plains with unimaginable force. He felt the vibrations in his bones as the storm ripped across the landscape, shredding everything in its path. Through the narrow slit above him, streaks of lightning illuminated the swirling dust like veins of light. Each flash lasted a heartbeat, but in that instant, the entire world was visible. The collapsing domes, the airborne debris, the chaos. He stayed motionless, his breathing steady, counting the rhythm of the thunder to track the storm's movement. The temperature dropped sharply, and the sand against his back grew damp as condensation formed in the cooler layers. The noise above became an endless roar, punctuated by the sound of structures snapping. Somewhere nearby, a cadet screamed over the comm, but the signal broke into static. Aaron turned off his transmitter to preserve power. He focused on keeping his body warm, pressing his knees to his chest, and conserving heat. His trench, narrow and compact, held the air still around him, protecting him from the brutal gusts above. As the hours passed, the storm continued without mercy. But in the trench, there was calm, a fragile pocket of silence carved by instinct and persistence. Aaron felt fatigue pressing on him, but also a strange satisfaction. He had trusted the earth instead of the tools, and the earth had given him shelter. When he finally allowed his eyes to close, the wind still howled above, but he remained untouched. In that moment, buried beneath the chaos, he understood something that the others had not yet learned. Survival was not about conquering the environment. It was about listening to it. When the dawn came, the storm would reveal who had truly understood that lesson. But for now, deep within his trench, Aaron Cole slept dry while the world screamed above him. The first light of dawn never reached the surface of Thoraxis 9. Instead, the morning began with a blood-red glow filtered through an airborne ocean of dust. Aaron awoke to a low vibration that pulsed through the ground beneath him. The storm had not passed completely. It had only quieted, shifting from furious chaos into a long, heavy breath that still carried the scent of iron and ozone. His trench, narrow and hardened by the storm's own pressure, had held. The sand walls were packed solid, the surface above sculpted smooth by the wind. He ran his hand along the inner wall, feeling the faint warmth trapped within the earth. He was alive, dry and unharmed, while somewhere beyond the ridges he could hear the distant crackle of damaged equipment sputtering out their last sparks. He climbed carefully toward the rim, moving with slow, deliberate effort so as not to collapse the hardened edges. The air above was dense and tinted brown. Static electricity still hung in the atmosphere, making the fine dust shimmer with faint light. He squinted against it and saw the landscape that had been transformed overnight. The once flat plain was now carved into a maze of gullies, broken domes, and twisted debris. Pieces of metal, polymer shards, and half-buried tools littered the terrain like the remains of a lost civilization. Every artificial structure had been torn open, the interiors filled with compacted sand. Aaron pulled his scarf over his mouth and started walking toward the last coordinates of the group. His boots sank deep with every step, and his lungs protested the heavy air. The silence was unnatural for a planet that had just screamed with so much violence. Even the wind seemed hesitant now, whispering through the ruins of shelters as if ashamed of its destruction. He spotted movement ahead, slow, unsteady silhouettes crawling from the debris. 3 alien cadets were trying to free themselves from what was left of a dome. Its force shield had burned out, leaving behind melted resin and cracked plating. One cadet, a translucent being from the Calith species, was missing an arm. The limb had shattered into shards of glass-like fragments. The other 2, both from the Drath, had burns across their scales, their suits sparking weakly. He quickened his pace and reached them within minutes. The crystalline cadet looked up at him, her light refracting unevenly through cracks in her body. Her voice was faint, distorted by static. "We lost power. The storm—" She didn't finish. Aaron didn't answer immediately. He crouched beside her, brushing sand off a vented respirator, then looked at the others. "Anyone else alive?" One of the Drath males shook his head. "Some ran when the domes collapsed. No signal from them." The other added, his voice rough from the storm. "We tried to hold position. The wind peeled everything. Even the energy cells fused." Aaron assessed the damage quickly. Most of their gear was useless. He retrieved a half-buried emergency pack and tore it open. Inside, he found a few rations and 2 water capsules, both still sealed. He handed one to the crystalline cadet, who hesitated before taking it. "Drink slow," he said quietly. "You'll absorb it better that way." She obeyed without argument, her voice shaking as she said, "Your trench, did it survive?" He nodded once. "It did." One of the Drath stared at him with disbelief. "You slept through that?" Aaron didn't answer. He simply checked the magnetic compass embedded in his wristband, then looked toward the east, where another line of darker clouds gathered. The respite would not last. He could feel it in the way the air pulsed. A new front was forming, angrier and more concentrated than the one before. He motioned for the others to follow. "We need cover before the next one hits." The Drath hesitated. "Where?" "There's nothing left." Aaron pointed toward the rocky ridge that bordered the horizon. "There. The rock will break the wind. If we can dig under it, we'll have a chance." He spoke with calm certainty, not as an order but as a simple fact. The others followed without protest. The walk to the ridge was slow and painful. The terrain, once level, was now a field of half-buried debris that sliced through their boots. Every gust raised spirals of dust that stung their skin. Aaron led the way, stopping occasionally to test the ground with his metal tool. When they reached the ridge, he found what he was looking for: a concave formation where the rock bent inward, creating a natural hollow. He dropped to his knees and began scraping the sand at the base, widening a shallow cavity into an entrance. The Drath males joined in silently, their clawed hands scooping faster than his tool could. The crystalline cadet sat close to the ridge wall, her fractured body trembling as the refracted light inside her dimmed. As the day burned on, the faint sun of Thoraxis 9 began to fade again, behind another curtain of rising dust. The horizon darkened into shades of red and gray. Aaron's instincts told him the next storm would hit before nightfall. They had only a few hours. He directed the Drath to gather debris, panels, alloy frames, anything that could reinforce the new shelter. They worked in silence, understanding the urgency without needing words. When the first distant roar rolled across the plain, the three aliens looked to him for direction. He gestured toward the pit. "Inside, all of you." The crystalline cadet hesitated. "What about you?" He shook his head. "I'll close the entrance when the wind starts. You stay low." Her voice trembled slightly. "You're human. You don't have shielding. You won't survive in the open." He looked at her steadily. "I don't plan to be in the open." Then he pushed her gently inside and began sealing the entrance with layers of compacted sand and alloy panels. As the wind picked up again, it carried an eerie hum, different from before, lower, almost resonant. The metallic dust in the air created flashes of light as particles collided, igniting static discharges that danced across the landscape. The storm was alive with color, veins of green and violet lightning streaking across the horizon. Aaron worked until the entrance was barely large enough for him to crawl through. He entered feet first, sealing the last opening with a slab of fused polymer. The world outside vanished, leaving only the low, vibrating rumble of the planet's fury. Inside the cramped shelter, the air was hot and heavy. The crystalline cadet sat near the back, her fractured arm slowly reassembling itself through an internal reaction. One of the Drath males pressed his back against the wall, his breathing labored. Aaron sat near the entrance, listening to the sound of the wind pressing against the walls like a living force. The shelter shook, but held firm. Sand hissed as it scraped across the outer surface, building a thicker layer that acted as insulation. He closed his eyes briefly, focusing on the rhythm of the storm. It pulsed like a heartbeat. Rise, pause, rise again. Each pulse lasted longer than the one before. Hours passed. The air inside the shelter began to cool, and condensation formed along the walls. The crystalline cadet extended her hand, collecting droplets that slid down the surface, absorbing them into her body. One of the Drath watched, whispering something in his native tongue, a phrase Aaron didn't understand but recognized as gratitude. For the first time since landing on Thoraxis 9, a fragile calm settled among them. The chaos outside became a steady background hum, almost soothing in its repetition. When the storm began to weaken, Aaron removed the polymer slab and crawled halfway out, testing the air. The wind was still fierce, but no longer lethal. Above him, the sky glowed faintly pink as particles refracted the weak sunlight. He scanned the horizon. The ground shimmered under a thin layer of melted glass. Far in the distance, something moved. A flicker of blue light. Perhaps a distress beacon, or perhaps just the last flicker of a dying dome. Either way, the lesson was clear. The planet rewarded endurance, not arrogance. He climbed back into the shelter and sat against the wall, his clothes caked in dust. The crystalline cadet looked at him with quiet awe. You read this world like you've lived here. He shook his head slowly. No, you just have to listen to it. The planet tells you what it wants. You stop fighting it, and it lets you live. The Drath beside her nodded silently. Outside, the storm's voice faded into a distant whisper. Aaron didn't know how long the reprieve would last, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This planet was not finished testing them. The real trial had only begun, and when it came again, he would be ready. The second storm passed more violently than the first, but when the sound of the wind finally quieted, an unsettling calm took its place. The planet seemed to hold its breath, and the air carried the smell of scorched minerals. Aaron remained crouched by the entrance of the shelter for a long moment, listening. Beneath the fading roar of the storm, he could hear the faint clicking of cooling rocks and the slow dripping of condensed moisture from the walls. When he finally pushed the sand aside and crawled out, the light that met him was eerie. Pale amber diffused through a veil of suspended dust. Everything glittered faintly, as if the land had been coated in frost, but it was glass, thin and sharp, reflecting the dull sunlight in fractured shards. He stood still, adjusting to the silence. His ears rang from the constant assault of noise during the storm, and now the emptiness felt almost hostile. Behind him, the crystalline cadet climbed out, her repaired arm glinting faintly. Her translucent skin refracted the light, casting fragmented patterns across the ground. The Drath males followed, shaking the dust off their suits. Their scales had dulled from exposure, and one of them coughed, a sound harsh and dry. Aaron noted it but said nothing. He began surveying the surroundings, calculating their next step. The ridge that had shielded them was cracked and pitted, but still intact. He traced the lines of impact where lightning had struck the rock, leaving molten veins of fused minerals. The ground nearby was smoother than before, as though the storm had flattened everything. His trench from the first night was buried under a new layer of compacted sand. He walked toward the open plain, his boots crunching over the fragile surface, each step breaking the glass crust with a sound like splintering ice. The horizon was hazy, and in the distance, a faint smoke trail curled into the air. That was new. Something was burning, which meant something was still alive. He turned to the others. "There's movement that way," he said, pointing toward the smoke. "Could be survivors or equipment. We'll check it before nightfall." The crystalline cadet hesitated. "What if it's another energy flare? The storms might have ignited something volatile." He met her gaze steadily. "If it did, we'll need to know what kind. Could help us build heat sources later." He began walking without waiting for a reply. The others exchanged glances and followed, driven more by instinct than by trust, though that trust had begun to form in unspoken ways. The walk took nearly 2 hours. The heat rose with every step, the glass crust radiating sunlight back upward until it felt as though they were walking between two suns. The crystalline cadet moved more easily than the others. Her body refracted the light away, but the Drath struggled. Their scales were designed for humid environments, not arid glare. One stumbled, his breathing shallow. Aaron stopped and signaled for the group to rest beside a fallen dome fragment half buried in the sand. He shaded his eyes and studied the smoke trail again. It seemed closer now, flickering in short bursts. Something mechanical was trying to stay alive. He scavenged through the wreckage near the dome and found a cracked power cell. It was leaking, the gel within sizzling faintly in the heat. He tapped the surface gently with a metal tool, then scooped a small portion of the gel into a heat-proof vial. "Conductive plasma," he muttered, half to himself. "Could be used for ignition." One of the Drath tilted his head, puzzled. "For what?" Aaron pocketed the vial. "For fire. We'll need warmth when the temperature drops tonight." The Drath blinked slowly, as if trying to reconcile the primitive concept of fire with the high-tech environment they were trained for. When they reached the smoke's source, the scene was grim. A small command pod had crashed headfirst into a dune, its hull twisted, its beacon half melted. The escape hatch was sealed shut from deformation. Aaron ran his hands along the seam and then jammed his tool into the crack, forcing it open with steady pressure. The door gave way with a sharp hiss of escaping air. Inside, the pod was dark, filled with burnt circuits and the sharp smell of ozone. A faint beeping still emanated from a console. He leaned in and read the flickering display. Substation 14A offline. Secondary relay operational. The crystalline cadet joined him, her glowing body illuminating the narrow space. "This could link to the observation relay," she said softly. "If we can get power to it, we might transmit a distress signal." Aaron nodded, scanning the walls. "The main power cell's gone. We can reroute from that emergency core if we stabilize it." He pointed to a spherical module buried in the console's base. It pulsed weakly, its containment cracked but functional. He knelt, unscrewed a melted panel, and began reconnecting wires by hand. His movements were precise, methodical, years of field experience guiding each decision. While he worked, the others stood guard outside, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The landscape shimmered under the heat, creating mirages that looked like shifting shapes in the distance. Every few minutes, one of the Drath would glance back at Aaron through the doorway, silently urging him to hurry. After nearly half an hour, a soft hum filled the air, followed by a flicker of blue light. The beacon's damaged emitter stuttered to life, sending short bursts of signal into the upper atmosphere. It wasn't much, but it was enough to register on the Academy's long-range sensors. Aaron stepped out of the pod and wiped the sweat from his face. The crystalline cadet watched him with quiet respect. "You repaired it without equipment," she said. He shrugged. "It just needed clean connections. Machines want to live, same as anything else." Her transparent lips curved slightly in what might have been a smile. "You think everything wants to live?" He met her gaze briefly, his eyes reflecting the orange horizon. "I know it." The group decided to rest until evening. The Drath gathered debris to form makeshift windbreaks, while Aaron examined the surrounding terrain. The next storm would arrive soon. He could feel the shift in pressure, the way the wind began to pulse in longer intervals. He marked a line in the sand with his boot, measuring the slope of the dunes. "We'll dig again before dusk," he said, almost to himself. The crystalline cadet tilted her head. "Another trench?" He nodded. "A connected one this time. We'll need cross channels to drain water and air. The storm isn't the only danger anymore. Temperature drops can freeze lungs if you breathe too fast." As the sun lowered, the heat finally began to fade. The air cooled sharply, and a fine mist of condensation formed over the glassy surface. The sky turned from amber to violet, and distant lightning flashed along the horizon. The group worked together, guided by Aaron's steady instructions. The Drath used their claws to dig faster, carving channels that connected at right angles, while the crystalline cadet compacted the inner walls by pressing her glowing palms against the sand, fusing it into a thin crust. By the time darkness fell, the network of trenches was complete, a labyrinth of shallow corridors interlinked by tunnels. They lit a controlled flame at the center using the conductive gel Aaron had collected earlier. The faint fire burned cold blue, flickering gently without smoke. For the first time since the trial began, warmth filled the air. The Drath sat close to it, their scales glinting faintly. The crystalline cadet watched the flame, fascinated by its fragile, organic nature. "It's alive," she murmured. "In a way," Aaron replied. "It consumes to survive." He leaned back against the hardened wall and listened to the wind above. The planet had gone quiet again, but the quiet was deceptive. The crystalline cadet turned to him after a long pause. "You think the others will make it?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the dark horizon where no lights flickered and no domes stood. "Some will," he said finally. "But this place doesn't forgive mistakes. It only teaches." She lowered her head slightly, understanding. That night, the temperature plummeted faster than expected. Frost crystals began forming on the edges of the glassy dunes, and the wind turned sharp and dry. The trenches held, keeping the group insulated. Aaron sat awake for hours, his mind tracking the pattern of the wind, learning its rhythm, preparing for the next storm. He knew the trial was more than a test of survival. It was a lesson about humility. The cadets had arrived with arrogance, believing their technology made them invincible. Now, the planet was stripping them of that illusion one storm at a time. When the first faint tremors returned, signaling the approach of a third storm front, Aaron looked up at the crystalline cadet resting near the glowing flame. "Get ready," he said quietly. "This one's coming faster." She opened her eyes, her internal light brightening with alarm. "How do you know?" He smiled faintly. "Because the ground just told me." And outside, in the distance, the wind began to scream again. The third storm arrived sooner than Aaron had predicted. The warning tremors grew into a rolling vibration that spread through the ground like the heartbeat of a giant creature waking from slumber. The air thickened until breathing felt like inhaling dust itself, and the sky, once violet, turned a deep, unnatural orange. Static flashes streaked across the horizon, pulsing in rhythm with the wind. Aaron stood at the edge of the trench network, his hands resting on the hardened sand wall, watching the horizon tremble. The others had already taken their positions inside the connected corridors, sealing entrances and checking for leaks. The crystalline cadet's glow shimmered faintly in the distance as she crouched beside one of the Drath, fusing a crack in the wall. He could see the faint tremor in her hands, fear mixed with exhaustion. Aaron scanned the open plain once more before descending into the trench. The land was changing fast. Sheets of dust began rising from the surface, forming spiraling towers that merged into the darkening sky. The sound that followed was not a roar, but a steady, continuous hum, as if the entire atmosphere had become a single vibrating string. He pulled the last metal panel into place, sealing the top entrance, and crouched in the narrow tunnel illuminated only by the blue flame they had kept alive from the previous night. It flickered uncertainly under the growing pressure of the air, but it did not go out. Minutes later, the storm hit. The wind slammed into the dunes with a violence that defied reason, turning the outside world into a churning ocean of dust. The shelter shuddered as shock waves rolled over it, but Aaron had built deep enough that the pressure only compacted the walls further. The crystalline cadet crouched beside him, her fractured arm casting pale light across the tunnel. One of the Drath gripped the hardened floor, his claws digging into the sand. The storm screamed through the air vents like an animal trying to claw its way in. Aaron kept his eyes closed, listening. Every storm had its rhythm. This one pulsed differently, less chaotic, more structured, like waves in a pattern. The sound had a strange pitch, almost musical. The sand wasn't just moving randomly, it was resonating. He placed his palm against the wall, feeling the vibration. The storm wasn't purely natural anymore. Something artificial was influencing it. He thought of the damaged command pod they had found, the broken beacon still sending intermittent pulses. Perhaps the energy field had interacted with the magnetic dust in the air, amplifying the storm into a harmonized resonance. Whatever it wasn't ordinary weather anymore. It was a planetary orchestra gone wrong. He needed to act. The vibrations were strong enough to compromise the structural balance of their tunnels. If the frequency increased, the compacted sand could liquefy and collapse. He looked at the crystalline cadet and motioned for her to dim her glow. She obeyed instantly, her light fading to a faint pulse. "Stay low," he whispered. "The frequency's building. We need to redirect it." Her eyes widened. "Redirect it? How?" He pulled the alloy rod from his belt and pressed it into the wall at an angle. "Metal channels vibration. If we plant enough of these, the shock will travel through them and release into the open air." The Drath beside him bared his teeth. "You mean turn the ground into an instrument?" Aaron nodded. "Exactly." The group worked in silence. The crystalline cadet moved ahead, her dim light revealing the inner corridors as Aaron hammered each rod into position with the blunt end of a broken tool. The sound of metal striking sand was almost drowned by the thunder outside. Each impact sent a dull echo through the earth. When he reached the final junction, he paused. The vibration had shifted again, lower now, slower. The storm was reacting to their interference, as if aware of what he was doing. The hum deepened into a low growl that made the entire trench tremble. Without hesitation, he pulled the last rod from his pack and forced it deep into the wall. The vibration traveled through it immediately, producing a faint metallic ring. The sound spread along the tunnel, overlapping with the storm's frequency. The two tones merged, creating a sudden pressure drop that made the air inside the trench lurch. The crystalline cadet gasped as the flame wavered violently, threatening to extinguish. But then, just as quickly, the pressure equalized. The hum outside broke apart, scattering into chaotic noise again. The resonance was gone. He sank against the wall, exhaling slowly. The others looked at him, their expressions a mix of confusion and awe. The crystalline cadet's voice trembled slightly. "You changed the storm's tone." He nodded, breathing hard. "We broke its rhythm. That's all it needed." The Drath looked toward the entrance, his eyes narrow. "The storm listened to you." Aaron shook his head. "No, I just listened to it first." Hours passed before the winds weakened. When the final gust faded, the silence that followed was absolute. Aaron pushed aside the top panel and climbed out cautiously. The air outside was cold now, almost freezing. The once orange sky had turned pale gray, and the sun was nothing more than a dim sphere behind layers of dust. The surface was smoother than before, sculpted into undulating waves of glass. In the distance, lightning flickered in slow pulses, too distant to hear. The storm had left behind not destruction, but stillness, a planet exhausted from its own fury. He scanned the horizon and froze. Something new glimmered far away, a faint series of blue lights, arranged in a line. They flickered in perfect rhythm, too precise to be natural. He narrowed his eyes, realizing what it must be. An automated probe from the Academy, still active, scanning for life signs. It was half buried in glass but intact. If they could reach it, they could send a clean signal through its comm array and finally mark their survival. He called the others out and pointed toward the lights. "That's our way out," he said. The crystalline cadet followed his gaze, her inner glow reflecting faintly off the glass dunes. "It's far," she said softly. "And if another storm comes—" He interrupted gently. "Then we dig again." The Drath males exchanged brief glances before nodding in silent agreement. No one questioned him anymore. The planet had taught them enough to understand that arrogance had no place here. They began their march. The ground was brittle underfoot, cracking with every step. The reflection of the sun off the glassy surface made the world look like a sea frozen mid-wave. After an hour of walking, the temperature began to drop rapidly. The air thinned, and the faint hum of approaching wind returned. Another storm was forming, but slower, more distant. They didn't have long. Aaron led them along a ridge, staying within the dips to minimize exposure. He could feel the magnetic pull from the probe growing stronger as they approached. The device was half encased in hardened sand, its beacons still pulsing. He knelt beside it and brushed away the debris. The power core was cracked but operational, its faint hum matching the storm's distant rhythm. He connected the emergency transmitter from the pod to the probe's input port, his hands moving quickly despite the biting cold. The crystalline cadet crouched beside him, stabilizing the power conduit with her glowing hands. The Drath stood watch, scanning the horizon where the new storm built like a shadow rising from the ground. When the signal finally transmitted, a soft tone echoed through the air, steady, strong, undeniable. The beacon flared once, releasing a pulse of blue light that shot upward into the dusty sky. Aaron leaned back and closed his eyes. The connection would reach the Academy's orbiting vessel within hours. For the first time since landing, he allowed himself to feel something like relief. The crystalline cadet looked at him quietly. "We did it," she said, her voice soft, almost reverent. He didn't smile, but there was a calm in his eyes. "We survived this one," he answered. "That's enough for now." As they turned back toward the ridge to find shelter before nightfall, the horizon flashed again, this time brighter and faster. It wasn't lightning. It was the storm's reflection, mimicking the probe's pulse, echoing it back across the plain. The planet was responding. The wind began to rise once more, but now it carried a strange rhythm, one that matched the signal they had just sent. Aaron stared at it in silence, realizing that Thoraxis 9 had learned from them just as much as they had learned from it. The storm was no longer just nature's fury. It was a dialogue. And for the first time, the planet was speaking back. The storm that answered the beacon was unlike any before it. It moved with intelligence, gathering speed not from chaos but from intention. The sky dimmed until the horizon disappeared, and the first gust carried with it a strange, harmonic resonance. Low, methodical, almost deliberate. Aaron stood motionless at the base of the ridge, his gaze fixed on the shifting wall of dust that advanced toward them. The blue pulse from the probe reflected across the approaching storm, flickering like a heartbeat echoed by the planet itself. The crystalline cadet stepped closer, her voice steady but low. "It's mimicking the signal. It heard us." He nodded slowly. "Yes, and now it's answering." He turned toward the others. "We need to move to higher ground," he said, pointing to the ridge's spine. "The lower dunes will fill first." The Drath males began climbing without hesitation, dragging fragments of the probe with them, small tools, wires, and what remained of the beacon housing. The crystalline cadet followed Aaron, her translucent body glowing brighter as the ambient light faded. The air began to vibrate again, not violently but rhythmically, as if the planet's magnetic field was syncing with their heartbeats. Each pulse made the sand shimmer in a wave, and with each shimmer, the storm drew closer. At the top of the ridge, the view was terrifyingly beautiful. The storm stretched across the horizon like a living wall, its edges twisting and curling inward, forming spirals that glowed faintly with trapped lightning. The resonance grew deeper, pressing into the bones. Aaron could feel his pulse aligning with it, an unnatural synchronization that made him dizzy. The crystalline cadet placed a hand on his arm. "You're vibrating," she said softly. He steadied himself and exhaled. "The magnetic field is increasing. It's reading us, maybe measuring the signal's source." He looked toward the fragments of the probe. "We gave it a voice. Now it wants a conversation." The storm hit the base of the ridge with a sound like 1,000 wings beating in unison. Dust and glass particles rose in dense clouds, climbing toward the summit in spiraling motions. The wind had a direction, a pulse, a pattern, never random, always measured. Aaron crouched and pressed his palm into the sand, feeling the vibration beneath the surface. It was steady, predictable, like a code repeating. His mind worked through the rhythm instinctively. The intervals between pulses were consistent with binary transmission. Short, long, short, short, pause, long, short. He glanced at the crystalline cadet. "It's sending data." Her eyes widened. "To us?" "Maybe to the probe," he said. "Or maybe it thinks we are the probe." The realization chilled him more than the wind. The planet had adapted. It was responding to electromagnetic impulses, copying and amplifying them. The beacon signal had become the template for a new atmospheric pattern. If it continued to evolve, the entire region could transform into a self-sustaining storm loop, rewriting the planet's magnetic equilibrium. That would erase any trace of their survival or signal. The storm would consume its own message endlessly. He looked up at the flashing vortex and understood that if they didn't stop it, no rescue ship would ever find them. He moved quickly, shouting over the wind. We need to shut the signal down. The crystalline cadet hesitated, shielding her eyes from the light. But the beacon is buried. Not all of it, he replied. The power relay's still transmitting through the fragments. We have to reverse the charge and ground it. He began descending the ridge, sliding through loose sand, his boots scraping against glassy surfaces. The others followed without question now, no longer cadets, but survivors bound by instinct. At the probe site, the blue pulse continued to throb steadily. The wind formed rings around it, like ripples radiating from a drop of water. Aaron fell to his knees beside the relay housing and tore open the panel. Sparks jumped as the connection flickered. He needed to reverse polarity before the next pulse or risk total feedback that could collapse the entire ridge. "Hold this," he said to the crystalline cadet, handing her the main power conduit. Her hands glowed brighter as she stabilized the flow, her translucent veins pulsing in sync with the current. The drath males anchored the metal rods from the trenches, driving them into the ground to form grounding points. Aaron twisted 2 wires together, then forced them into the wet sand, letting the mineral moisture conduct the discharge. The storm's rhythm intensified, as if sensing resistance. The pulses grew faster, shorter, almost frantic. The ground quivered. The crystalline cadet gasped as the energy in her hands surged, flooding her body with radiant light. "It's drawing power from me," she cried out. Aaron moved closer, gripping her wrist. "Hold it steady. Just one more cycle." He slammed the relay switch, reversing the current. A blinding flash tore across the sky, cutting through the storm like a blade of light. The pulse inverted. The harmonic hum shifted from resonance to static, breaking its perfect rhythm. The storm's motion faltered, spirals unwound, dust clouds dispersed in uneven bursts, and the steady beat collapsed into silence. For a few seconds, no one moved. The planet seemed to freeze mid-breath. Then the wind began to slow, its fury dissolving into a whisper. The sky cleared gradually, revealing the dim, washed-out sun hovering like a ghost through the haze. The air was heavy with charged ions, but it was no longer hostile. Aaron looked around at the quiet landscape, now smoothed into rippling glass dunes that stretched endlessly in every direction. The probe was dark, its light extinguished. The resonance had stopped. He turned toward the crystalline cadet. Her glow had faded almost entirely, leaving faint cracks along her surface. She looked exhausted, her voice faint but steady. "You broke the pattern." He nodded. "We silenced it before it learned to repeat itself." She smiled weakly. The storm listened again. "Yes," he said softly, and this time it stopped talking. The drath males stood silently, their scaled faces reflecting the pale light. The ridge that had been their battlefield was now still, its surface glittering like frozen water. In the distance, the faint sound of engines echoed, deep, mechanical, familiar. Aaron turned toward the horizon and saw it, a dark silhouette descending slowly through the haze. The rescue vessel. The beacon's final pulse had reached orbit before they shut it down. He exhaled deeply, feeling the tension in his chest finally release. As the ship touched down, its thrusters melted shallow grooves into the sand. The hatch opened, and a wave of clean, pressurized air swept over them. Uniformed officers rushed forward, scanning the survivors with handheld devices. One of them stopped in front of Aaron, disbelief flickering across his face. "You're alive," the officer said. "The command log recorded your entire sector as destroyed." Aaron glanced at the crystalline cadet and the drath males before replying. "Not destroyed," he said quietly. "Redefined." The crystalline cadet stepped forward, her repaired arm glinting faintly. "The storm learned from us," she said. The officer frowned, clearly not understanding. Aaron looked back at the horizon, where faint ripples still shimmered under the sunlight. "It's not just weather," he said. "It's the planet's memory. Every storm is a record of what came before. We taught it to listen, and for a moment it did. When the ship lifted off, the surface below looked peaceful again, but Aaron knew it was only resting. As the clouds closed beneath the thrusters, he watched the faint reflections dance across the dunes, forming shapes that looked almost like moving shadows. The planet was alive, restless, aware, and waiting. Back aboard the vessel, debriefing officers asked him for technical details, meteorological data, and survival logs. He gave them only what mattered. "The storm shredded every shelter," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But the ground remembered how to keep us dry." The crystalline cadet sat beside him, silent, her glow returning slowly under the ship's soft light. Through the viewport, the pale curve of Thoraxis 9 faded into the distance. The planet looked serene now, almost inviting. But Aaron knew better. He had heard its voice, felt its rhythm, and understood its language. The storm was not an enemy. It was a teacher. And he had learned the lesson that would outlast any report or academy medal, that survival was never about conquering nature, but about listening to it long enough to earn its mercy. As the stars swallowed the planet below, he rested his head against the cold metal wall, closed his eyes, and for the first time since landing, allowed himself to sleep without fear. The storm had ended, but its song still lived quietly inside him, a steady human heartbeat echoing through the silence of space.